At 4 in the morning the diner smelled of oil and coffee and the kind of exhaustion that had its own taste. Bren Calder worked a rag along the chrome rail, felt a blister split and kept going. The clock above the pie case blinked an angry red, the numbers refusing to smooth into morning. Outside, Route 90 lay like a ribbon of promise and threat. Cars that passed were already ghosts by the time she checked the window. Jun slept on a curled jacket behind the counter, the child's breath a small, reliable thing against the diner's hum. She had a way of making herself small inside places like this. Shoulders tight, voice soft, the kind of posture people mistook for shyness when it was, in fact, a careful rationing of energy. The diner had been the stopgap that sharpened into routine, tips enough for a bowl of soup and a night at the motel, unless a trucker was feeling generous. In 2 weeks the motel would expect full rent, and after that there was nothing to pay. Motel room number 3 was already lined with small debts. Laundry quarters under the mattress, an IOU to Holt Weaver for the last can of oil, a stack of empty syllables like later and next week that never added up. A pair of boots thudded on the linoleum toward her. The stranger sat, removed his jacket, shoved a plate across the table like he was sliding cards, not offering charity but connecting two solid things. She looked at the meal. Eggs thinly fried at the edges, a chunk of home-baked bread stained by butter, stew-warm beans that smelled like the kind of home she hadn't had in 3 years. "Come eat with me," he said. His voice didn't push. It was plain, a blunt instrument of invitation. There was a scar along his jaw and a thumb that still carried the faint stain of grease, proof of hands that did work, not words. There was something about the way he ignored the bright diner lights as if they were a stage and not the world, and it made Bren straighten. She considered the plate and the invitation as one item, edible and dangerous. To sit would be to accept a stranger's kindness. To decline would be to preserve the armor she'd worn so long it had become part of her. She didn't know his name. He didn't press. He let the plate rest between them like an honest thing. Her fingers hovered. The diner hummed. Jun snored in a breath that rose and fell. The grease trap gurgled in a rhythm Bren had learned to ignore. She ate. After the first mouthful, the relief felt less like surrender and more like oxygen, brief, incandescent. The man watched her with a sort of careful distance that suggested he had seen too many people who needed things and too few who could take care of them. When she reached for the coffee he poured himself, he didn't ask her story. He slid across a small folded note, an address scribbled with an even hand and 3 words beneath it, Iron Hollow Ranch. "Work?" Bren said after a moment, tasting the coffee, feeling the heat spread in a way the motel never did. "Work," he said. "Come to Route 90, I'll show you." There was an economy in his speech that felt like a lifeline and a test at the same time. Bren held the note as if it were a fragile thing. The stranger, who had a presence like a closed gate, firm and shut, stood up, slipped his boots on, and left a small bill on the table. He left his jacket and the silence around it. Bren finished her shift. The sun that found its way through the diner's windows was a tentative thing, as if it needed permission to wake the town. She took Jun to the motel, counted the cash, smoothed the crumpled note, and memorized the address. The numbers on the motel ledger looked less like debt and more like both a deadline and a dare. She had half a mind to fold the paper back into her pocket and let destiny be a thing that remained someone else's problem. But there was Jun, hair sticking up in the morning light, a toy rabbit with a missing ear gripped in small fists. Jun's smile atomized Bren's caution into something workable, maybe not brave, but practical. She called Holt. He grumbled, as Holt did, like a countryman who grumbled because he cared and because grumbling was safer than praise. "You sure you want to leave the county, Bren?" Holt said, and with him there was always a little town square of opinion circling the phrase, "leave the county." "Iron Hollow's been shut tight for a while. You know them Maddox brothers, hard to get close." Bren told him what she had already decided. She told him the note said Route 90, Iron Hollow Ranch, and that the man had been blunt and unceremonious. Holt made a sound halfway between blessing and warning, and offered, on his own, like a man who had been a fixture in her life, that if she needed any supplies before she left, he'd knock it off her bill. "Just," he said after a pause, "mind your girl. Nobody around here's a saint, but Iron Hollow tends to be different. People talk." "Different's fine." Bren said. The word felt like a bridge. On the road to Iron Hollow, the sky folded and unfolded itself into layers. Bren drove slow enough that Jun could nap in the back seat without bouncing, watching the way ragged fields became open pasture. The ranch's sign came up on the horizon, Iron Hollow in weathered white letters, a hand-carved horse rearing, the wood gray with age. There was a porch that sagged only slightly, and a barn that leaned like an old man listening to the wind. A gate hung open, leading to a gravel lane that remembered tire marks from a long time ago. Thorn Maddox stood on the porch when they arrived. He was a silhouette that filled the doorway, broad shoulders, a coat that had seen winter after winter, and boots that had gathered layers of work into the leather. He had the look of someone who'd been hit by the world and had chosen to stand anyway. His jaw was shadowed with beard stubble, and there was a line of pale scar tissue that tracked along his temple, an index of past collisions. He watched them come down the drive with a regard that was more inspection than politeness. "You Bren Calder?" he asked. "Yeah," she said. Jun tapped her fingers on the glass as the motel day's last light ran thin across her hair. Thorn led them inside without making a show of pleasure or surprise. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and something that could have been stew. There were 3 rooms, a spare with a narrow bed where Bren and Jun would sleep, a tack room where tools and the ghosts of past maintenance lived, and an office with a heavy desk and papers that hinted at a life that had once been organized, then left alone long enough to collect dust. "This is a job, Calder," Thorn said. He said it as if repeating it might make it safer. "Not pity, not a charity case. I pay $800 a week. You do the house, the accounts, and the daily animal work when you can. Jun can help with the chickens. There'll be food. There's a small apartment. You'll get 2 days off a month, and whatever schooling you can arrange for the girl." Bren felt the number like a pulse, $800. It was a week's worth of rent and a cushion she hadn't seen in months. It was also a wage that meant hard labor and accountability. She looked at Jun, who was already pressed to a window watching a mare paw the pasture with the curious concentration of children. The number sounded like dignity spoken in plain English. She swallowed. "I can do that," she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. Thorn nodded like a man finalizing a ledger. "You'll start today. I don't have time to babysit. If something breaks, fix it. If you need parts, make a note and I'll take care of it. You keep the books clean and the work honest, and you'll have your check. That's all." There was a pact in his words. Work and pay, clarity and boundaries. It appealed to Bren. She had been saving an account in her head for months, frugal assumptions, coin-stacking rituals during midnight breaks. She had a notebook with columns she sometimes imagined as a future instead of a fantasy. In college, she'd almost finished accounting before life rearranged priorities. Numbers had always been where she felt control, a place where cause and effect weren't polite guesses but predictable certainties. The ranch offered a ledger and the chance to write something that didn't vanish. Her first week at Iron Hollow was an initiation by ordinary things. The days fell into the steady rhythms of backbreaking work, mending fence posts splintered by winter's weight, dragging water hoses across fields that turned to mud at the touch of late spring, tying down hay bales and stacking them like promises in the loft. She learned to recognize the sound a cow made when it was about to calve, the way a colt would test a human's patience and heart. Each task, when completed, sat like a bead on a string. They began to form a chain that led away from motels and toward possibility. Jun made the ranch her own in small ways. She left her rabbit on the hay pile and woke each morning to find it restuffed with straw. She coaxed a litter of kittens out from behind the feed shed and named them ferocious things like Cinder and Match. She collected eggs like treasure and bartered them with other kids she met at the county school bus stop. She learned to feed the hens, to hold the calves' heads steady while Thorn salted a wound, to talk to a lonely horse when his breathing made music. Thorn did not make overt gestures. He fixed the roof beam before Bren could find a ladder tall enough. He would appear with a pot of coffee on days when rain had chased everyone indoors. He would remove a screw from a girl's toy rabbit and replace it with one of his own making. His acts were practical, mechanical kindnesses that did not smooth over pain but made life bearable. They were the kind of help that didn't demand conversation. Bren respected it the way she respected a machine that kept running. Efficient, necessary, and a little implacable. The early relationship was a careful negotiation of space. Thorne repeated that phrase, "This is work," like a mantra. Bren repeated her own private list of terms: dignity, pay, a roof for Jun. The boundary kept things from tipping into dependence. There were small human exchanges that suggested more without promising it. An extra bowl of stew left on the back stoop, Thorne standing a little longer when he brought feed, the way he answered Jun's questions with an effort to be patient. A week in, Bren found a photograph tucked into a ledger under a stack of unpaid bills. It was the kind of photograph that held a past too heavy for a single frame. Thorne as a younger man, his arm slung over another man who laughed with reckless joy. A brother, she inferred from the way their bodies fit together with the ease of shared history. The other man had eyes like thunder, and a name scrawled on the back in fading ink, Elias Maddox. The photograph was smudged at the corners as if someone had thumbed the same place out of habit. Thorne came in from the corral while Bren was looking at the picture. He didn't comment on it. He put down a bucket and leaned his head back like a man unhooking tension. There was a gravity to him in those private moments. Bren respected the distance between curiosity and intrusion. "You're keeping things tight," he said. His sentence could have been a compliment or a warning. Bren didn't parse it into smaller things. She slid the photograph into her pocket like a thing that needed to be protected from accidental revelation. In a place where privacy was a currency, a photograph could be both treasure and trap. Her bookkeeping started as a utility and became a kind of architecture. Bren uncovered ledgers and invoices that showed a ranch sliding into arrears, a missed feed order here, a delayed mortgage payment there, a mechanic's bill carried on credit. She traced the money like a detective, not because she intended to be one, but because numbers did not lie. They told a story of decreasing margin, hay costs that had risen 3 seasons in a row, a buyer who had postponed cattle pickup until the market warmed, a line of credit from a small bank that had begun to inch its attention toward the property. The first time she took a call to a feed supplier, her throat tightened with a tremor that had nothing to do with the phone. "We can hold your order for 2 weeks," the voice at the other end had said, an economic incision masked by politeness. Bren felt like she had been handed a ticking clock. She wrote down dates, made lists, built a plan in which small, reliable revenue could stagger the ranch away from the line where foreclosure became a word worth fighting. 2 weeks for a hay delivery is not the end of the world," Thorne said later in the tack room when she presented him with a list. He tended the edges of the ledger with the meticulousness of someone cleaning a gun. "But cattle don't wait for calendars. We sell in May. If we miss that market, we miss more than a season." Bren folded the list into her pocket. "We adjust our schedule," she said. "We tighten expenses. We give priority to the herd and to the equipment that keeps it alive. We renegotiate the buyer dates. We find another hole if we have to." "You've got a mouth for this," he said. There was no warmth in the sentence, but it held an admission of competence. Outside of work, the town provided its own textures. Sheriff Boone stopped by once, an old man with a face like a map of winters. He had been in office longer than Bren had been alive. His visits were the kind a man made when he wanted to check that a fire hadn't started in someone's hearth. He asked the right kind of questions because he didn't like surprises. He listened to Thorne in a way that acknowledged his pain without trespassing into it. He watched Jun with the sort of interest older men reserve for grandchildren they never had. He mentioned, casually, that the county clerk had noticed an uptick in inquiries about Iron Hollow. Letters, phone calls, people asking about ownership records. "Don't fret over much of what folks say," the sheriff advised, which in his mouth meant be alert and manage the paperwork carefully. Holt came out to the ranch one afternoon with a box of tools and a gossip that smelled like payback and concern. He asked after the stranger who'd slid the plate at the diner with the same amused curiosity one reserves for a plot twist. Bren found that people loved to narrate a life for her as if she had the leisure to be told how she should live it. Holt, however, carried with him a small kindness, a binder of local contractors, a list of people who might take hay on shares, a phone number for a fence repair crew that worked cheap but honest. These small interventions seeded the ranch with the kind of support system that wasn't flashy but durable. A neighbor who lent a trailer when the old one refused, a woman at the feed store who slipped Bren a discount when she wasn't looking, a retired mechanic who called to say he had a few hours free if they needed help on a truss. Bren translated those favors into a plan. She worked late into nights after chores, her headlamp haloing the kitchen table where invoices and ledgers lay like a civilian's map of war. She called buyers and negotiated shipment dates, calculated margins that left no room for error, ordered supplies with a math that felt sacred because it meant survival. She insisted on a monthly payroll ledger, even when there were only 2 people on it. She made sure every hour Thorne's hands put into the place was recorded. The ledger became the proof of legitimacy, a resource when things got rough and a record the bank might accept as evidence of active stewardship. There were moments when the old pain softened around Thorne. Once, after a calf had been born limp and then livened by muscle and salt, Thorne sat on the corral rail looking at the newborn and inhaled as if the air could carry away something heavier than damp hay. Bren sat beside him, shoulders nearly touching, and he said the minimum of words. "Elias used to whistle to the calves," Thorne said. The name hit the air like a stone. He had a way with sound, made the cattle think farmhands had a tune. Bren listened. She didn't pry. In the silence that followed was a kind of mourning that didn't need an invitation to be present. There were other residues of the past. Old handwriting on the ledger suggested a management style that had once been organized. Elias had apparently been the kind of man who counted things carefully and trusted numbers. The contradictions between the 2 styles, Thorne's silent endurance and Elias's meticulous planning, were visible in the architecture of the ranch. Where one had been lax, the other had kept things in balance. Whatever had happened to Elias had left a hole Thorne refused to name. Despite Thorne's insistence on work and practical gestures, the ranch began to show signs of repair under Bren's steady presence. A truss that had threatened to collapse was rebuilt in a multi-day sequence that turned into a communal set piece. Bren and Thorne and a retired mechanic named Sal lifted beams, braced with cables, and told practical jokes in between grunts. They exposed old rusted nails, measured spans, and hauled planks up into the rafters like the arc of a new life being hammered into place. At one point, Jun scampered across the loft and dropped her toy rabbit through a crack, and Thorne climbed and fished it out with a careful kindness that made Bren watch him like someone observing a sunrise. The barn's new truss held. It creaked in the first wind and then settled into a steady, reliable sound. The repair was not triumphal, no fanfare, just a sense that something had been made less precarious. When Sal left, he clapped Thorne on the shoulder with the familiarity of someone who'd seen many ranches and judged them on their ability to stand and to feed. "Keep it up," he told Thorne. "You've got people here who know their way around a hammer." Bren kept building systems. She set up a simple spreadsheet, a hybrid of the old notebook and the bank statements, and printed a cash flow chart that looked honest and plain. Numbers do not feel like hope to everyone, but to Bren they were a map of where not to fall. She scheduled cattle sales, kept the receipts, wrote a letter to the buyer to confirm dates. She balanced an account with the sharpness of someone who had once been training to make sense of the world's decimals. Each line she corrected felt like adding another plank to the porch she now stood on. The community responded in the typical small-town way: curiosity, caution, and an odd generosity. The sheriff came through twice more with a report and a piece of advice. Holt stopped by to remove a cracked window and to gossip in a way that softened into the kind of friendship that knows its place. People who had once only seen Thorne in the distance began to drop by with hot pies or with offers of labor, and returned when Bren asked them to take a load of hay on shares. It wasn't a wave of miraculous salvation, it was a slow accretion of help, the cumulative pressure of small hands doing what they could. And yet there were edges where the path still cut. One evening, a man in a dark sedan stopped at the county clerk's office and asked pointed questions about deed transfers and liens. The clerk, used to suspicious people and to those whose legal attentions were sudden and sharp, made a note. Sheriff Boone mentioned it to Thorne as casually as he could. The air around the ranch tightened. Bren felt the change before Thorne did, because she had grown used to reading the ledger for mood as well as numbers. There was a line in the accounting that suggested incoming legal interest. Someone had flagged the property in a way that made the bank take notice. She made a copy of the page and slid it into the binder she kept on the kitchen table. "Paperwork," she said the next morning when Thorne came in from the cold. "Something's asking for a look." He didn't snap. He listened. He took the copy and turned it over in his hands like someone assessing a tool. For the first time since she'd arrived, his eyes moved quickly, the way someone who'd been caught between things did when he measured a new potential harm. "We'll file counter notices," Bren said before she could stop herself, the little administrator in her stepping forward. "We document our expenses, we show the buyer that we're on track, we contact the bank." He nodded. There was a small gratitude in his face, not spoken but visible. They began to make a plan, as if paperwork and steady effort could be a kind of prayer. The morning before Bren found the first sign of an active threat, Jun ran in from the yard with a scrap of glossy paper clasped in her hand like a small treasure. "Someone left this by the mailbox," she said, eyes bright. It was a color ad with a tidy photograph of a woman, poised, practiced smile, a hat that said money moved comfortably in her life. Under the photograph, the name Rowena Ashcroft was printed in a font that suggested a business card more than a threat. Bren studied the ad in the dim kitchen light. It promised help for property owners, assistance with financial restructuring, and a line in small print about expedited legal services. There was a phone number. Jun traced the name with a finger as if it were the start of a map. "Probably a realtor," Jun said, meaning it in the way children name everything within their grasp as easily explained facts. But names are sticky things. Rowena Ashcroft had a cadence to it that didn't fit the town gossip. She sounded like a woman who managed things in offices that smelled of lemon cleaner and legal pads. Bren slid the ad into the binder between a receipt and the copy of the interested party's inquiry. She had a sense, subtle and prickling, of a person who would not be satisfied with polite questions at the clerk's window. That afternoon, while Thorne was out repairing a fence line knee-deep in mud, Bren called the number printed on the ad. The woman who answered had a voice that smoothed edges like steam on a window. She asked polite questions. Had they considered restructuring? Were they aware of liens? Might they be open to an assessment? Bren kept the conversation guarded. She asked for a written proposal instead of making promises. The woman agreed, obligingly, and said she would follow up. The woman's name felt like a new current in a river that had been running steady until now. The rest of the day passed under a simmer of unease. Thorne didn't act outwardly concerned, but at dusk he lingered longer at the house than usual, and when he spoke, he seemed to be measuring words against a history he wasn't willing to name. Bren found him later at the small cemetery on the ridge, where Elias Stone waited like a paragraph in the past, simple, weathered, a name chiseled into stone with dates that ended too soon. Thorne knelt, his boots sinking into the soft dirt. He placed a small bundle of wild grass on the grave and traced the letters as if to make them legible again. Bren stood at the edge of the plot like someone respecting private weather. He didn't look her way. He let the sky hold his silence. "It's not the first time someone tries to make a tidy end to what doesn't want to be tidy," he said finally, not directly to her, but because he knew she was there. People look for ways to finish things off when they don't understand that some things just need time. Bren studied him, the way grief had compressed and resisted in him. She thought of the photograph she'd seen, 2 men and a laugh, and of the ledger with its half-erased numbers. She thought of Jun asleep in the little spare room at the ranch, and of Holt's small acts of neighborly scaffolding. She thought about the diner and the plate, the way a plate had slid across a table and changed everything. She resolved, as the days narrowed and the work thickened into routine, to make the ranch something like a ledger that balanced, work measured, expenses tracked, obligations met. She would do the math until the numbers made sense. When someone called with an offer that smelled like quick fixes in crisp print, she'd offer paperwork instead of emotions, evidence instead of suspicion. She would be the kind of presence that didn't ask for pity and refused to accept it. That night, a car came up the gravel lane and stopped under the low porch light. Bren was folding linens and the sound made her pulse flick, the way any unexpected thing does at a ranch that had been used to certain assumptions. She wiped her hands and walked to the kitchen door. The car idled. A woman stepped out in a coat that had been pressed with a tailor's bones. Her heels reasserted themselves on the gravel like punctuation. She carried a small leather folder. For a moment they looked at each other like two people who had both chosen their roles. The woman smiled in a way that could have been warmth or practice, and Bren wondered which it was. The leather folder was closed. The porch light caught the woman's features and made them seem deliberate. "Thorne Maddox?" the woman asked. Thorn emerged from the shadow inside the house and met her question with a single word. Yes. The woman opened the folder with a neatness that suggested she knew how she wanted the world arranged. She introduced herself as Rowena Ashcroft. She said she had come to talk about, politely, precisely the future of Iron Hollow Ranch. Bren felt something settle in her like a pebble dropped into a jar. It made a hollow sound. The hair on her arms prickled. The ledger on the kitchen table seemed suddenly too small to contain what was likely coming. She stepped back into the house and, within her, the sequence that started with a plate slid across a diner table began to rearrange itself into a line that might curve toward a threat. Outside, under the porch light, Rowena's smile stayed steady as she extended a card. In neat block letters, the name looked like a promise and a warning at once. Bren held the card in her hand like a new piece of paper that might either bind them to a future or make a new set of calculations necessary. She did not yet know which. Inside the kitchen, the ledger lay open. The sound of the car was like a punctuation mark. The ranch, like any good ledger, would have to balance. The woman with the leather folder had arrived with the kind of intent that could be measured in clause and consequence. Bren looped the photograph of Elias back into the binder and tucked the ad for financial restructuring beside it, as if storing all the pieces of a puzzle in one place might help keep their edges from colliding too hard. She looked at Jun asleep under the small quilt in the spare room, the toy rabbit with its missing ear tucked into the child's arms. She wanted, more than she had wanted anything in months, to make sure the bed stayed beneath the child for as many dawns as a ledger could guarantee. She would not let a polished voice with a leather folder decide, without contest, the future of the place that had become their shelter. Thorn spoke to Rowena with the same economy he'd used with Bren. Practical, measured. He offered coffee as if that alone could catalyze a conversation into civility. Rowena sat on the porch, crossed one leg over the other, and laid out a map of possibilities in terms that sounded like dots connecting in an arrangement that had been designed in boardrooms. She spoke of property rights, of liens, of possible revenue channels, and the advantages of outside management. She was the kind of person who packaged risk as opportunity and labeled it clearly. Thorn listened. He did not sign anything. He did not make promises. But Bren watched his hands, calloused, patient, the hands of the man who had rebuilt a truss and fixed a toy rabbit, tremble only once, a small private thing. When Rowena had finished, she leaned forward and said, almost conversationally, "There are ways to move quickly if you'd prefer to spare yourself a long season of worry. Sometimes the best thing is to let professionals handle the interim work." There was a pleasant cruelty in the neatness of her phrase. Bren could see it as a threat or as a business proposition. She did not have to decide that in the porch light. For the moment, she stacked her resolve like a pile of invoices. Proof, organization, action. She would not let professionals sweep in with promises that would erase the work they'd already done. She would show proof of labor, payments, and careful stewardship. She closed the ledger with one decisive hand. The town might whisper, Holt might offer tools and gossip, the sheriff might check the public records. Rowena might have a smile bright enough to polish a document into trust. But the sequence that had begun with a plate and a stranger's invitation had produced something sturdier than a single night's food. It had produced a woman who could read numbers and a child who could coax kittens out of hiding. It had produced a ranch that, while bruised, was being made ready to stand. Rowena rose from the porch finally and tucked her folder beneath her arm. She tilted her head toward Thorn and said politely that she would be in town reassuring the bank managers of the local office that someone was taking an interest in the property. She left the way a piece of weather departs, inevitable and leaving behind an altered air. Bren watched the taillights dissolve into the dusk. She felt the ledger's weight in the binder and the photograph of Elias in her hand, two artifacts of a past and a present that had collided on her kitchen table. The ranch's future, it seemed, would be written in ink and argument as much as in sweat and feed. She had come because a plate had been slid across a table and because an open invitation had been, briefly, the shape of a new life. She had taken the job and begun to rebuild fences and hope. Now there would be questions that needed answers. Who exactly was Rowena Ashcroft, and what price did she imagine for help? What strings would she attach to her offers? And would Thorne's past, which sat like a photograph in the ledger, yield the kind of leverage an outsider could exploit? Bren closed the back door and turned the bolt. Jun stirred, high and small, and asked for water. In the quiet of the kitchen, as the wind keyed itself against the roof, Bren folded the payroll ledger and put it into her bag. She made a list of calls to place in the morning. The bank, the buyer, Holt, Sheriff Boone. Each phone call would be a small ritual of defense. Outside, the ranch settled into its usual noises, a distant cow lowing, a horse shifting in a stall, the slow eddies of wind through the pasture grass. Inside, on the kitchen table, a plate sat clean from the breakfast that had started everything. It had been such a simple thing, a gesture, a meal. It had become a hinge, a point from which futures turned. Bren touched the rim of the plate and felt the thinness of the ceramic under her fingers, and for a second she allowed herself a small private gratitude. For the stranger who had not asked for anything in return, for Holt's battered kindness, for the way work could carve a life into something solid. Then she made herself a coffee, the way a person who intended to stay awake through a long night does, and began to write the next day's ledgers. The clock in the kitchen chimed somewhere past midnight. Outside, a car returned, headlights making the road a thin strip of white. The name Rowena Ashcroft was a small invasive possibility that had arrived with a leather folder and a polished smile. The work and the defense would need to proceed in equal measure. Bren flipped open the ledger again and began to catalog the day's wins. A calf birthed and thriving, a repaired truss, a week's worth of bills in order. She added a line. Possible outside interest. Investigate Rowena Ashcroft. She underlined it once, twice. In the margin she wrote a single word. Protect. It would be hours before anyone pushed the porch light into darkness, before the wind updated its map of the property with a new footnote. She watched Jun breathe, young and unbothered in the face of large things. Below their small house, Iron Hollow held its own. Weathered wood and stubborn beams, a photograph with the name Elias carved on the back, and a man who measured grief against labor. Everything hinged on a plate. Everything that came after had the shape of that first, small kindness. A simple invitation with consequences that spread like rings in still water. There was work to be done, ledgers to correct, a woman with a folder to understand. The ranch exhaled, and the night folded it into the future. If this story matters to you, tap like and tell us where you're watching from. Rowena left with the same composed smile that had been her armor. She drove back down the gravel, her taillights slicing the dusk, and the ranch settled into its peculiar Midwestern hush. The kind that kept its own counsel. Inside, Bren closed the ledger and made the call she'd promised herself she would. Holt answered on the second ring. The sheriff called back with a promise to look into county filings, and the feed supplier agreed to hold their next delivery, as long as they'd put down a small deposit. They moved forward one cautious step at a time. But Rowena's visit had done something subtle and sharp. It had shifted the air, changed assumptions. For the first time since Bren had arrived, the ledger had not only been a map of survival, but a tool of defense. She cataloged everything, every call, every ad, every approach at the clerk's window, and slipped the pages into a colored folder she labeled Rowena. She knew from nights of cleaning table crumbs under diner lights that a name on paper could gather too many hands if you left it unguarded. She would not let that happen. The next morning, Thorne left early. He had a list of fence posts that needed resetting and a cow with a swollen flank that required time and salt. Bren worked alongside him in the chilled air. His hands moved with the competence of someone who had done this for decades, and his face was a ledger of small private reckonings. He was quiet on purpose, as if every word could crack something he was keeping whole. "She's the sort who makes things tidy on paper," Thorne said once while they both hauled a sagging board. "Makes them look like they were always meant to fit." Bren listened. She didn't say anything about the way his voice carried the name Elias like an unfinished sentence. She kept her own counsel because she had learned that the best leverage in trouble was being prepared and practical. Rowena's presence expanded along practical lines. The county clerk called to say a document had been filed the day after she left, a notice expressing interest in intervening for preservation. A phrase that sounded bureaucratic until Bren read the clause beneath it. The notice did not by itself give Rowena the right to sign anything. What it did do was invite bank scrutiny and establish a paper trail that would be used to argue urgency. The bank would see that someone had taken an interest, their auditors would want to respond. It was subtle and shaped like strategy. Bren spent afternoons at the kitchen table with the binder open and a stack of county records fanned out like evidence. She went to the clerk's office and read public filings until her eyes blurred. There were mortgages, a line of credit with a regional lender, and a late payment notice that had triggered a call to the ranch the previous winter. Nothing illegal, yet, but something smelled like leverage. A clause in one of the bank's communications that suggested they might be open to a management agreement as a temporary measure if someone presented a viable plan to cover operational shortfalls. In other words, if a professional manager appeared and promised to bring immediate cash flow, the bank might be inclined to accept third-party oversight to avoid a foreclosure sale. It was the space Rowena had been aiming to occupy. Bren's fingers traced the ink of a promise that had not yet been written. She considered what Rowena's arrival had been, an attempt to convert urgency into opportunity. Rowena's brochure had not brought her a legal claim, it had brought attention. Attention can become a shapeable thing if someone has the confidence to put a contract in front of a man whose hands still smelled like the world. That night, Thorne sat by the small stove with a mug cupped in both hands. He watched the flame of the burner, and Bren watched him watch it. They had been near each other long enough that their silences had become a language. She saw how his shoulders held a history. She saw, too, the way he calculated the cost of grief in action, not in dramatic confessions, but in the steady avoidance of anything that would reopen the wound. "They want to help," he said finally. "They want to manage what's theirs to manage now," Bren replied. She kept her voice even. "Not everything that looks like help is. We document. We do our cash flow. We show the bank the proof. We control the narrative, Thorne." He listened. He had begun to let her do the talking in these matters because he trusted the ledger where he did not trust his own memories. "Elias used to joke about paperwork," Thorne said, and for a moment a smile flickered across his face like a page turned. "He said the best thing you can do for a ranch is make someone else keep receipts. Figure out what's true and then hold it up." Bren's work split into two tracks. The physical labor that kept the animals fed, and the administrative labor that kept the bank's attention diverted from spectacle and toward numbers. She tightened the schedule for the sale season, contacted buyers she'd met at county auctions, and arranged for a series of small but reliable shipments that would produce visible receipts. She scheduled hay deliveries so the herd would be export-ready when the buyers came, and she set aside a reserve measured in constancy, not an end to all risk, but a model of competence. Rowena did not sit idly by. She smiled at the coffee shop on Main Street and left another business card with the banker's assistant. She appeared at the county cafe and asked to see public notices, all of which were outwardly lawful and keenly performative. The town had seen many people like her, skilled in surface civility, practiced at translating urgency into contract. She played each community channel with skill, and in the way of practiced intruders, she asked the right questions that suggested authority without necessarily requiring it. Bren kept a list of every contact Rowena made and added it to the binder. She began to notice patterns. The way Rowena always suggested professional management when the question of grief or inexperience was raised. The way she framed Thorne's grief as a risk rather than the aftermath of a tragedy. It was a rhetoric that treated human history as business inefficiency, and Bren found it softening the edges of people who might otherwise feel sympathy for Thorne. "Watch the words," Bren said to Holt when he offered gossip in a low voice over the fence. "She'll dress mercy as management." Holt chewed his pipe thoughtfully. "She speaks like she's been to law school and to lunch with bankers," he said. "But there's always two doors to keep open, one for the people and one for the forms. Keep both." That same week, a contractor whom Sal recommended called in sick. Bren had scheduled him to assess an aging irrigation pump. Without another mechanic, Thorne and Bren went out to the field with a tow rope, some oil, and a toolbox. The pump was loud and stubborn. It took them half a day to get it to turn over, and for the first time Thorne let Bren take the lead in calling for parts and negotiating a price. People in town noticed. So did the buyer on the telephone when Bren calmly confirmed delivery dates and bank transfer details. These were the small wins that count in a slow recovery. The buyer, a meat cooperative 2 counties over, liked stability more than drama. Bren's steady voice about dates and weights reassured them, and they agreed to a shipment schedule that would, if executed, produce enough revenue to cover operational expenses for 2 months. Rowena noticed, too. She sent a neat, formal email praising Thorne for opening the ranch to strategic oversight, and offering, in the same message, to draft a preliminary management proposal that would safeguard the estate pending longer-term decisions. She did this in language that looked like assistance and felt like a stake being driven into the ground. Bren intercepted the email and, instead of replying, called the bank manager. She laid out a simple chronology and explained what they'd achieved in the past 3 weeks. She asked what the bank needed to feel secure. On the line, the manager offered the kind of answer that smelled of cushion and truce. Documented revenue, a realistic budget, and a named interim contact who could be responsible for deposits and disbursements if Thorne found it useful. The bank would prefer that Thorne remain in title if he chose, but they needed assurances. That was the opening Bren had hoped for, not a requirement that someone take over, but a cavity where genuine stewardship could be demonstrated. At the same time, Rowena began hosting polite dinners in town, inviting people who mattered, county associates, a few board members at the bank, even a buyer's agent. She presented a plan that looked shiny on paper. Immediate infusion, hiring a manager, modernizing sales channels. It sounded persuasive when spoken over wine. But Bren suspected that under the gloss was an option, the small print that allowed a manager to recoup costs by securing a future transfer of interest at a depressed rate, a tactic that sounded like a rescue to those who didn't read the schedule of fees. Bren's precaution turned into a direct action the afternoon she overheard Rowena on the phone outside the feed store. Rowena thought she was alone. She spoke in that smooth, low voice she'd used in the diner, and Bren recognized the cadence from a conversation she'd been in earlier. Rowena's words slid into the air. Get him worried about running things by himself. Make him think the easy way is to sign the temporary agreement. Once he's signed, we control the cash flow and can protect the asset until it can be sold. Yes, the option to purchase will be there, but that's standard. We protect the investment. Bren felt something in her chest that was not anger so much as a deep, practical alarm. She had always believed small things had long shadows. This was one of those shapes. She could confront Rowena in the moment, but the woman was practiced and had a retort for compassion. Bren needed something sharper than accusation, evidence, documentation. She opted to gather proof. Over the next days, Bren arranged a sequence of small, decisive steps. She logged the buyer's confirmations, she time-stamped the feed invoices, she copied public filings and saved the bank's automated emails. She recorded, with her own phone line, a conversation where Rowena spoke to a local associate, someone she'd persuaded to appear innocuous, about accelerating the process. Bren did not invent anything. She captured what Rowena said and matched it to the binder's chronology. There was a risk in the act of recording. Laws on one-party recording vary, and Bren did not want to cross a line that would make the evidence inadmissible. She made sure the recording was of a phone call where she was a participating party. Rowena, confident and practiced, did not realize her words would be used against the approach she had rehearsed like a script. The next move was a demonstration. Bren asked Thorne for 10 minutes in the office while she set out the documents and played the recording. It felt like chess. She arranged the papers in neat piles, buyer confirmations on the left, feed invoices in the middle, bank emails on the right. The binder that had been so useful sat there with hardware clips and the label she had written in a hurry, Rowena. Sit, Bren said. Listen. Thorne did as he was asked. He had always done as asked if the ask was a job and not an intrusion. Bren hit the play button. Rowena's voice swelled into the quiet office, practiced and oily. Bren had forwarded the call to Sheriff Boone, who agreed to come by and be present not to dictate outcomes, but to witness the exchange. There was no grandstanding, only a clear sequence of facts arranged like tools on a bench. When the recording finished, Thorne sat with the silence like a lump of something weighing the room. He had always known people made plans in their absence. He had always suspected that his grief could be used as an accounting footnote. But hearing it, Rowena's voice treating his life as an asset to be managed, hurt in a way that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with being devalued. She was going to get me to sign something to protect the ranch until she sold it, Thorne said finally. His voice was flat. She called it professional stewardship. You said it yourself, Bren replied. You said this was a job. She calls it stewardship. We show the bank our records. We show them we're trading honestly, and we don't sign anything that gives an outsider a right to recoup through a purchase option. Thorne's face had a tide of something inside it, anger, fear, and relief, that spilled into the conversation. I don't want to be managed by a stranger who thinks she knows my brother better than I do. Sheriff Boone, who had a slow and steady voice, sat back with his palms folded. You can set the bank straight, he said. They want proof, not poetry. They want receipts and a plan. They won't hand the keys to someone on a handshake. Bren arranged a meeting with the bank manager for midweek. She had the numbers, the buyer confirmations, and the recording. She put the binder in the back seat of her truck like armor. She called Holt and asked him to be at the ranch that morning to help with a shipment. Sal volunteered to move equipment on short notice. The town's neighborly muscle was a resource Bren had been careful to cultivate. She wasn't asking for miracles. She was asking for people to show up with their hands. Rowena, sensing the tightening, reached for different instruments. She sent Thorne a letter couched in conciliatory phrases and a bouquet of flowers delivered with a card that read, "For the good work you're trying to do." Her public face softened, but her private moves accumulated like an advancing line. The midweek meeting at the bank corridor felt like an ordinary Tuesday until it didn't. Bren entered with Thorne and Sheriff Boone. The bank manager, a woman whose desk had seen messy estates and orderly entrepreneurs alike, read the binder and listened to the recording. Rowena, who had learned to move through such spaces with strategic calm, showed up with paperwork and a legal representative who smiled with a practiced neutrality. Bren presented the buyer confirmations, the feed invoices, and the shipment schedules. She did not beg. She showed numbers. She showed a plan that projected enough revenue to keep their operational obligations current through the season. The bank listened. Rowena's representative spoke about professionalizing the operation and referenced clauses that might make a third-party manager attractive to the bank as a short-term measure. The manager asked for clarity on the proposed fees and the option schedule. It was then that Bren played the recording. Rowena's voice unfurled in the small office again, slick, confident, describing an accelerated push to create leverage by getting Thorne to sign the temporary agreement. The bank manager's polite expression shifted. The representative for Rowena tried to interject, but the sheriff, who had his own low voice and a conviction for plain speaking, pointed out the recording's implication, concealing an option to purchase by framing it as emergency management. The bank manager put the file down. She had seen used and then abandoned ranches before, and she didn't want a reputation for being party to a poor bargain. After a quiet consultation with her legal counsel, she said what Bren had been hoping to hear. The bank would respond to evidence and good faith offers. They would not, without cause, transfer operational control to an outside manager whose fees included an option to acquire the property. The bank asked for a written management plan that demonstrated how revenues would be handled and asked for Thorne's confirmation that he would remain on title and retain oversight. In the months to come, the bank's response would not be a shield forever. It would be a window of time to perform. But in that moment, it was a barrier to Rowena's more predatory aims. Her representative, seeing the bank's posture shift, closed his laptop with the economy of a person who knows when an argument is not worth continued effort. Rowena's smile thinned at the edges. She left the building with the same composed gait, but Bren saw in the way she clenched her hand around the folder that she had been met with resistance she had not anticipated. Rowena had expected the bank to prefer immediate liquidity over a drawn-out plan. In this town, the people who worked the land were stubborn about more than fences. After the meeting, Thorne walked with Bren to the truck. They had both been careful. The exchange had been practical rather than theatrical. Thorne's step was not lighter, but something unnameable had shifted. "You did this," Thorne said. It was not a question. Bren shrugged. "We did this," she corrected him. "You let me do it. You let the ledger speak." He looked at her then in a way that was more than the quiet of work. "You kept us together, Bren. You kept our numbers in a row." She looked away because there were things she would not answer too quickly. She had not come to Iron Hollow for praise. She had come because a plate had been slid across a table and a man had offered a chance. But the recognition in Thorne's face landed like a warm thing. Rowena retreated to another tactic. If newer, more discreet maneuvers did not work, she would try to fracture confidence. She courted a few of the town's more mercurial voices and insinuated that Thorne was either too grief-stricken to be in charge or that his management style was romantic and not businesslike. She spread an image of herself as a professional savior whose interests, she argued with practiced sincerity, were aligned with the property's longevity. It wasn't long before some town voices repeated the phrase professional management without critical punctuation. Bren answered every time with numbers and receipts. Every time Rowena proposed a shiny option, Bren put forward a shipment schedule or a buyer confirmation. The contrast, substance versus gloss, gradually set town attitudes like stones into mortar. There was, however, a moment when Thorne's old habit of retreating re-emerged. The photograph of Elias and him, which she'd found early on, had started to appear in Thorne's hands on lonely evenings. One rainy afternoon, he took Bren with him to Elias's grave, pushing through mud in heavy boots. The cemetery was low and honest, a sweep of rock and grass. Thorne sat on the low stone and spoke like someone naming seasons. "I keep thinking about the day," he said, "about what I could have done. People think grief is a thing you endure. It's a job you keep being asked to do." Bren placed a hand on his forearm. "You kept this place going after he was gone. You put your body into the work when the rest of it needed hands. That's not nothing." Thorne shook his head. "It's not a medal, it's a responsibility, and sometimes it's a weight that keeps you from looking ahead." Bren recognized the familiar shift. His guilt had a way of becoming a lock. While Rowena tried the charm offensive in boardrooms and cafes, Thorne's instinct was to punish himself, to withdraw. If she wasn't careful, his retreat could manifest as an action, handing over management in a moment of weakness to someone who said the right words. So Bren began an unusual practice. She insisted on practical rituals. A weekly ledger review at the kitchen table with coffee and a napkin for notes. A daily check-in where Thorne would list what needed immediate attention. An hour each week where they would call the buyer and confirm schedules together. These routines were not sentimental, they were therapy of action. They anchored Thorne to present competence and away from the temptation to sign something out of emotion. As the shipment dates drew close, the ranch hummed with precise work. Buyers came with their own demands, cattle weighed to specification, paperwork signed, vaccinations up to date. Bren coordinated the loadout like a conductor. Thorne loaded trailers and told the drivers which pens to pick. Jun watched with the sort of bright attention children give to a scene where adults are doing something important. On the morning of the first big shipment, the cooperative arrived with a trailer and a purchase order. The scale read numbers Bren had steered them toward, numbers that would produce enough cash to cover the immediate operations and to cushion them for another season. Rowena, watching from afar, tightened her jaw. Her attempts to find a legal foot in the door had not been successful. The bank had chosen to work with Thorne under a plan that required transparency, and the town, one neighbor at a time, had decided to trust the work they could see. It was not a universal conversion, people are never so easily rearranged, but it pushed Rowena back into a posture of pivot and recalculation. That evening, after the cows had been counted and the trailer had rattled down Route 90, Thorne sat on the porch and cleaned a pair of old boots. He had an ache in him that had nothing to do with labor and everything to do with an answer he had not given himself. He handed Bren a rag and kept the rhythm of his movements measured. "You did this for me," he said again, and the sentence finally arrived with the weight of admission. "No," she said, and she meant it the way someone means a fact. "I did this because it mattered to Jun and it mattered to you, because it matters that the land that feeds us be fed in return, because that plate slid across the table and I decided to take a step." Thorne's mouth softened. "You could have left." "Maybe," Bren said, "but this is where Jun sleeps now, and I had a way with numbers once. I thought I could help, and I did." He looked at her then, as if measuring distance. The porch light cast a circle that made everything near it seem more intimate. For a while they sat in the quiet, the only sound the slow settling of the barn. The photograph of Elias, which they had placed on the small mantel in the kitchen, seemed to watch without intruding. If there was a tenderness between them before, it had been cautious and wrapped in the shape of work. Now, after a shipment had been completed, and after Rowena's attempt had been bluntly exposed, an unspoken possibility expanded into the space they shared. It did not snap into place like a scene in a play. It threaded itself in small touches. Thorn handing Bren a coffee mug, Bren leaning into an elbow when she laughed, Thorn's rare smile that looked like dawn. They did not immediately name what they might be to one another. There were forms of partnership to negotiate, payroll, responsibilities, how they would handle public representation. They had to be careful because affection in a fragile place could be read as leverage by others, so their closeness remained private and practical. A shared look across a cluttered desk, a hand on the small of Bren's back in the barn while she guided a calf, a conversation about business at night that sometimes dissolved into talk about faster things. Books Jun liked, the way Elias had laughed in that photograph. Rowena did not give up easily. She pursued a different route. If she could not acquire the ranch by contract, she could attempt a purchase through a corporate vehicle. She canvassed investors and tried to make the sale look like an inevitable market correction. But the ranchers in the cooperative preferred a seller with a story and a reputation. Rowena's approach felt transactional to them, and they preferred to continue the relationship with Thorn and Bren if it proved steady. The cooperative's preference mattered. Market choices are moral choices in a small economy. Beside these external pressures, Thorn's internal work continued. He began to show up for things that had once felt impossible. Bren suggested he meet with a counselor in the county who specialized in grief, someone who met farmers on their time and in their language. Thorn resisted at first, then he delayed, then he went once and returned with a small differentness about him, a willingness to say a name without the lock of memory pressing closed. "People think grief finishes," he said once to Bren, "but it just changes where you keep your things." "You keep the good with the hard," Bren said. "That's not forgetting, that's honoring and continuing." In the middle of summer, when the fields were furred with green and the barn smelled of shavings and sweat, Rowena returned with a new suit and a new script. She had a smaller smile and fewer allies. She called the bank to reopen discussions about the possibility of assistance and left it at that. The bank, which had seen the ranch move with the rhythm of actual work, asked for documentation. Rowena could not produce the same kind of evidence because her plan had been built around the idea that urgency would obscure the audit. The auditors preferred real numbers. At a point when Rowena's options dwindled, she tried a final gambit. She visited the buyer's agent and offered a side deal to expedite the sale if Thorn signed an agreement granting Rowena an interim power to manage. The buyer, who had already agreed to their schedule, frowned at the idea. "We buy cattle," he said bluntly, "not management rights. We buy the product of responsible people. We don't want drama." Left with a narrowing path, Rowena chose to leave. She wrote Thorn a clean note that read, in its last sentence, "I wish you peace." It was the kind of line a professional uses when they know they have exhausted their options. Bren found the note on the kitchen table and folded it into the binder. It was the last entry for a while under the tab labeled Rowena. Life inexorably became less dramatic and more steady. The cooperative's payments came in, the feed invoices were paid in orderly fashion, and the barn's rafters settled as if relieved. Jun grew into summer with a ferocious appetite for picking eggs and for the small knowledge of where things went. Milk to the fridge, hay to the loft, the way a kettle should whistle. She made friends in town and started a small list of things she wanted. Some were childish, some were practical, a new pair of boots, a proper rabbit with both ears. There was still land to repair and money to manage. Bren and Thorn formalized a working agreement, payroll, job descriptions, a contingency fund. They set up a small joint account for ranch operating costs with a sign-off system that required both of them for major expenses. It was a structure that reflected their respect for each other's space and the need for transparency. It did not signify romance on paper, it signified competence. They were partners in the way two people can be who both want the same future and are ready to put the ledger on the table to prove it. Outside, the town's narrative shifted. People told the story of a woman who had gotten a plate at a diner and chosen a second chance. They told it with the sort of admiration that small towns reserve for stories that end with competence rather than spectacle. Holt told Bren that he always suspected she would do well. Sheriff Boone nodded in ways that said, "Good work," without fuss. The cooperative kept its partnership with Iron Hollow because they trusted the production and the people who had delivered it. And the romance, the slow burn of two people put back together by common labor, took its time. There were nights after a long day when they sat on the porch and the moon made silver of the fence posts. Thorne would tell a small story about Elias, and Bren would tell a small story about Jun in the motel room before she left. They found a rhythm where talk about the future was practical, plans for a better water pump, an idea about a small CSA subscription for the town, talk about how Jun might start classes in the fall, and in the quiet, in the meetings that were both domestic and strategic, their hands began to find each other with less calculation and more warmth. One evening, after they'd closed 3 months of steady ledgers, and after the cooperative had sent a particularly kind letter about the quality of the herd, Thorne found Bren in the barn. She was cleaning the tack when he approached, boots soft against the straw. He carried a small plate, ceramic, unadorned, that looked like the kind of thing used for a shared breakfast. He slid it to Bren across an upturned crate the way someone might reveal a small truth. "I thought you might like some stew," Thorne said. His voice had the measured economy of someone offering something without ceremony. Bren's laugh was small. "You, the man who used to hand me coffee, now brings stew." He shrugged. "You showed me how to make a list and keep it. I thought I'd show how to make something with it." They ate in the barn under a single light, shoulder to shoulder, and the plate between them felt like a sacred object that had traveled from a diner's table into the field of their lives. It was a quiet rite of reciprocity. The woman who had been given a plate now shared it with the man who had once offered it. The circle felt complete, but not finished. Life, after all, moves like a ledger. Their consent to explore what they were between them was careful and adult. After the stew, Thorne asked Bren if she would consider, quietly and without pressure, allowing him to walk with her to the porch. She agreed. On the porch, he held her hand for the first time in daylight, fingers warm and calloused. There was a conversation about boundaries, parents first, lovers second, business always in the open. They made small promises to tell each other the truth about money, to respect Jun's place in any future plan, to discuss before making major commitments. The kiss that followed later was a consensual, patient thing, a seal on a set of choices, and not a leap into some unearned fantasy. It was, in the best sense, the product of shared labor and mutual respect. Autumn came with a thin cold that sharpened early mornings. The ranch moved into a better rhythm. The pumps were replaced, the barn's truss had settled firmly, and they had saved for a new hay trailer. Bren met with a small group of local producers and proposed a modest subscription box for the town, a way to sell poultry and small cuts directly. She created an invoice template and a delivery schedule. Thorne, who had at times been suspicious of anything with the smell of marketing, watched her set the plan in motion and, surprised, found himself proud. Jun, for her part, began to sleep with both ears of her stuffed rabbit. She had a list of school supplies and a plan to join a small after-school group where she'd learn to read faster. She loved visiting Sal's garage, where he would let her tighten a bolt or two with a gentle grin. She began to draw pictures of cows with smiling faces and brought them home to pin on the refrigerator. One late afternoon, the sheriff stopped by with a letter that announced the bank had updated its file. Iron Hollow was no longer a case of imminent concern. The sheriff read the letter aloud, his voice steady and pleased. The town's small cheer that followed was not loud, but it was sincere. The bank had seen the shipping receipts, the buyer agreements, and the solid ledger. They'd concluded the ranch had a plan, and the people needed time to execute it. Rowena, once a sharp profile on their edge, receded into the larger world of deals and portfolios. Her name appeared in the courthouse filings once more, but with different counties and different properties. She'd moved on where she could. Her presence had been a trial, and tests can leave scars. The important thing was that the ranch had not been traded for a quick promise. Time did not flatten things into a happy ending. There were storms that knocked down fences, and a bout of pneumonia in a calf that required constant attention. But the work had become a shared project, and a place where competence made room for tenderness. Thorne went to the counselor a few more times and brought Bren a note once that said only, "Thanks," in a shaky hand. They laughed at that note like two people who owned a small private joke. By winter, the ranch's books looked disciplined. Bren had set aside wages and a small emergency fund. Thorne had agreed to a plan for estate work that included updating whomever he chose to list as a successor if anything happened. They had, together, written a plan that included Jun, both immediate schooling and a long-term trust that Thorne had insisted on contributing to, showing that his fear of losing everything had been replaced with a promise to protect it. Their standing in town shifted from curiosity to respect. Parents at Jun's school invited Bren to bake pies for the full fair, and Holt grinned and told tales of the day Bren carried the heaviest beam without complaint. The photograph of Elias remained in a small frame over the kitchen counter, a quiet reminder of the past that had helped shape their present. Whenever Thorne looked at it, he seemed to be checking the direction of his own compass. He no longer looked away in a way that suggested he carried the whole weight of the past alone. Spring arrived with small miracles that were not miraculous. The tap of chick feet, the calf that stood steady this time, a buyer who paid on time. The ranch's future had been stabilized not by a savior, but by routine and the accumulation of countless competent acts. On a bright morning as the cattle grazed and the mailbox grew a little heavier, with bills that now read like obligations instead of threats, Bren walked out to the gravel drive where a small hand-painted sign hung that read, "Iron Hollow, home of the Maddoxes." The sign had been nothing when she had first arrived, a board of faded letters. Now it looked as if someone had touched it up with care. She carried a plate across the threshold to the porch and set it beside the flowered mug Thorne had made from an old coffee can, the same mug he had used when the winter felt unkind. Jun ran out with a straw hat and hugged Bren's legs. "We're having pancakes," she announced with the catechism of a child who knows essentials. Thorne came up the walk with oil on his hands and a grin that looked less like defense and more like relief. He set his boots by the step with their inevitable scuffs. The boots had accompanied him through most of his life. They had become a motif in the ranch's story. Bren looked at them, then at him, and felt gratitude that had no need for loud announcements. "Come eat with me," Thorne said, the words echoing the small invitation that had once been offered at a diner at 4 in the morning. The echo was not accidental, it was a recognition of the chain of kindness. Bren slid onto the porch step and took the plate. They passed stoves and pans and children and plans across one another like old habits becoming new rituals. As they ate, the sun warmed the boards and the cattle grazed beyond the fence. Sheriff Boone rolled by in his truck and waved. Holt came down with a pie and a new joke. The town had settled into an equilibrium that valued the work done and the people who did it. It was not perfect. There were still advisor letters and maintenance work to schedule, but it was, in the way that matters most, steady. In the weeks that followed, Iron Hollow opened a small stall at the county market where Bren sold eggs in small cuts labeled Iron Hollow, Maddox, and Calder. People bought with the knowledge that their money supported labor and not empty promises. Thorne offered tours for school children, pointing at a photograph of Elias and telling stories about calf whistles and stubborn horses. Jun sold jars of pickles, which she insisted were worth every penny. The cooperative sent a letter congratulating them on steady performance, and Bren put the letter in the binder with a small private smile. The final scene, if one could call it final in a life that kept moving, was simple and domestic. On a plain Saturday, Thorne and Bren sat on the porch with Jun between them, the toy rabbit with both ears now repaired and perched on Jun's lap. A plate sat in the center, empty now, the trace of last night's stew ringed on its surface like a faint map. Thorne reached over, set his hand over Bren's and squeezed once, deliberate and gentle. "You were the hinge," he said quietly. "You came in when you could have walked away." Bren let the phrase sit because she had learned the value of small speech. "You opened a door," she answered. "You slid a plate across a table. We both took a step." They laughed, a small and genuine sound. The photograph of Elias, the ledger, the repaired truss, the boots, the stuffed rabbit, the plate, each had held a piece of the story. They had been small things that accrued meaning over time. The kindness that started it all had not been some blazing miracle. It had been simply a plate and a choice. Outside, Route 90 carried trucks and lives forward. Iron Hollow settled back into its work, into the unsensational and sustaining acts that make a place live. Thorne and Bren kept their agreements and their promises. They loved, with the cautious joy of people who had built a foundation by honest labor. Jun grew, in ways that mattered, a kid who knew where eggs came from and how to count change and how to say, with conviction, that her family was enough. If there is a lesson, it is not the radiant one of instantaneous salvation. It is quieter. Small kindnesses can be hinges, but hinges must be turned. They need work, oil, and time. They need people who will show up again and again, who will read ledgers and fix pumps, who will name grief and then measure the steps out of it. The chain of events that began with a man sliding a plate across a diner table ended in something that looked like community, a set of people doing the next right thing with the tools at hand. On a late afternoon, when the light made the pasture look like a field of copper, Thorne set another plate on the table and slid it toward Bren. She smiled, took it, and passed it back a little fuller this time, filled with pancakes and the kind of butter that melts into small gleaming rivers. Jun's laugh tinkled like a bell. The ranch breathed in and out, as steadies things do, and the world of their days moved on. If this moved you, subscribe for more true-to-life stories and share it with someone who needs hope today.